I'm Effie Parks. Welcome to Once Upon a Gene, the podcast. This is a place I created for us to connect and share the stories of our not-so-typical lives. Raising kids who are born with rare genetic syndromes and other types of disabilities can feel pretty isolating. What I know for sure is that when we can hear the triumphs and challenges from others who get it, we can find a lot more laughter, a lot more hope, and feel a lot less alone. I believe there are some magical healing powers that can happen for all of us through sharing our stories, and I'll take all the help I can get.
Once Upon a Gene is proud to be part of Bloodstream Media. Living in a family affected by rare and chronic illness can be isolating, and sometimes the best medicine is connecting to the voices of people who share your experience. This is why Bloodstream Media produces podcasts, blogs, and other forms of content for patients, families, and clinicians impacted by rare and chronic diseases. Visit bloodstreammedia.com to learn more.
Hey friends, welcome to the show. This is Once Upon a Gene, and I'm your host, Effie Parks. I'm so everlastingly grateful for you and your support. Thank you for showing up and listening and sharing this show with your friends. If you haven't yet, think about going over to Apple Podcasts and sharing a rating and review for the show. It helps people decide whether they want to listen or not, and I'd really appreciate it. Also very excited for our episode today. I'm joined once again by one of my favorite people in the rare disease world. If you haven't heard of her, you're in for a treat. But if you've been following this podcast a while, you've heard her on 2 episodes. Episode 144, where she talks about how she changed the IEP landscape in La Jolla, California, and episode 210, where she's joined by her colleague, and they talk about all things genetic testing. So today, in this episode, we're getting into some exciting new initiatives from GeneDX, especially ones that can make a huge impact for patient advocacy organizations. We're talking about telehealth access to exome and genome testing, and a big commitment to the Cerebral Palsy community, and a brand new data tool called the Discover Snapshot. If any of you were at the Combined Brain meeting several months ago, maybe last fall in 2024, you got a little bit of it. We're going to dive deep into it today and help you understand how you can use it and why it's so valuable. It's all designed to shorten the diagnostic odyssey, strengthen advocacy, and open doors, ultimately, to treatments and community. Gay brings heart and experience and the science, and I know you're going to feel exactly why she's such a trusted voice in our rare disease world. So let's get into it. Please enjoy my conversation. Welcome back to the show, Gay Grossman. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you, Effie. It's really great to be here.
Yes, it's always my pleasure to have you. If anyone hasn't met Gay Grossman yet, you're in for a treat. 1, we're talking about genetic testing, many of our love language. And 2, the first one, she's actually sharing a lot about being a seasoned rare mom to a 27. Wait, did she turn 28? 28-year-old?
She's 28.
28? She talks about how she changed the La Jolla School District IEP program. She's a boss. So make sure and head back and listen to those episodes to learn more from Gay, because she is a fountain of wisdom. So, Gay, welcome to the show. Today, we're going to talk about a couple exciting initiatives that GeneDX is running, and I'm excited for especially some patient advocacy orgs to hear this episode and get the download on it. So, could I please, other than what I did, get a little short, brief introduction to you as a parent and what you do at GeneDX?
Sure. I'm really excited, Effie, to be here today representing GeneDX and talking about what we do with providing accurate and actionable diagnoses. But first, I just want to put a little plug in. Did you see that GeneDX was named one of Fast Company's most innovative companies for innovation to drive impact for patients?
Yeah, I did. Gay, I saw that on LinkedIn yesterday, I think. So congratulations to you all. That's really exciting. Anytime I see you guys winning, we're all winning.
Thanks. That's why I love working at GeneDX, because they have a true commitment to serving patients. So I've been at GeneDX for 1.5 years, and I am here to provide the best experience for our advocacy partners, which is families. So we talk a lot about genetic testing, and we talk about genomic data, which is what we're here to talk about today.
There are a lot of companies out there who have positions of patient engagement on staff, and it's very rare to have one who's actually had that lived experience. So you have a very special position there, Gay. And I know you speak for families like mine at your job. So I appreciate it. And I appreciate GeneDX, obviously, knowing how important you are to that mission.
Yep. It changed Lily's life and it changed our family's life. And I am dedicated to making sure that families have a very short diagnostic odyssey, unlike ours.
Amen. Well, let's talk about the importance of exome and genome testing, because I know we're both super passionate about it, and so are so many of our friends listening. So why is exome and genome testing so critical for families who are seeking a diagnosis?
Well, I'm really glad you asked this question, Effie. This is one of our favorite topics to talk about. So a lot of families may be familiar with maybe getting a microarray, and that really only has a 9 to 20% diagnostic rate, whereas a genome can get up to 48%. So families really are going to be able to get a diagnosis the first time they have genetic testing.
I know that you and I talk about genetic testing every day, and we did before you even worked at GeneDX. It is so important, and I see so many families flailing every single day in especially Facebook groups, wondering about the symptoms that their kids are having, and they're either not getting offered genetic testing, or families think they've had all the testing and they're having those chromosomal microarrays like you were just talking about, and like in multi-gene panels instead of an exome test.
I always say that, the panels were great when they were great, but things are different now. They're different than when I went through it with my daughter, even when you went through it with Ford. It's really the standard of care is an exome or a genome test for families. And if they're looking to get a diagnosis and they have a diagnosis already like cerebral palsy or epilepsy or autism, it's really important that they understand that there is a one test, exome genome test, that they can get through their healthcare provider to get them the answers that they need. And you and I have talked about this a lot, that when we were going through the school district and had a diagnosis of cerebral palsy, mitochondrial disease, all these descriptive diagnoses, it helped explain a little bit about what the symptoms were, but it didn't actually give us the genetic diagnosis that enabled us to engage in research. And that's really the difference. So if you want to unlock access to, potential treatments, clinical trials, even insurance coverage for medical equipment, different therapies, you really need a genetic diagnosis to move past.
Well, yeah. And also potential future challenges or other comorbidities. I know, as I've told you before, with CTNNB1, the disorder my son Ford has, there are two very big red fire trucks that nobody would check for had they not had that gene diagnosis, where they would have something called FEVR, where they eventually go completely blind, and also having tethered cords, both things that doctors would refuse to look at had they just had, an overarching descriptive diagnosis of something like CP. So big deal.
Really big deal. And your favorite topic, Effie, finding your community. There's nothing that is as important as finding a family that's just like yours, that's going through the exact same symptoms, experiencing the exact same challenges in school, wanting to get into a natural history study or a clinical trial. There's nothing like meeting that family for the first time that is challenged with the same diagnosis as your child. And building the community is so important.
I mean, it literally gives me goosebumps thinking about everything that a community offers you, and even beyond just your gene-specific one. Because as we know, we're all sort of in this together. So amen to that. And yeah, all the practical things that you mentioned, insurance coverage, equipment, therapies, school, which you were so good at, all of those things. So important. And okay, so this is something I've been celebrating now for a couple weeks, and it's also something that I have been praying for. And when I got to meet the most beautiful CEO in all the land, Catherine Sulin, I even said to her, cerebral palsy is so important to me. I really hope GeneDX picks this up as some sort of pillar. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the new commitment that you've all made. There's a beautiful page on your website about cerebral palsy. So give me the down low on it.
Well, this is really exciting because GeneDX really has a commitment to the cerebral palsy community. And we believe that every child who has a diagnosis of cerebral palsy should get a genetic test. And, exome, genome, those tests were kind of on a pedestal in the past, but they're accessible to families now. And families need to know that it's accessible to them. They need to ask their clinician for it. And if they can't get it, we have a partnership with Genome Medical where they can actually get a test through the mail, through telehealth.
So explain that for someone who hasn't slept in 3 days. Explain to families how they can access that and do that.
Well, if they go to GeneDX.com, we can give you the link, Effie, so that you can put it in the show notes. But there's a page there that explains how to have access to testing. And it will give information about, there's a button right there that they can click and they can get to Genome Medical. They can get in touch with a genetic counselor or a healthcare provider within a day or two. And they're able to get that pre-testing counseling. They're able to get the appropriate test for their child or their loved one, and then they get the test results and the post-counseling afterwards. So it's really all of it right there through their telephone, through their virtual computer, however they want to access it from their home. And in the past, as you know, the access has really been a challenge for families because there aren't a lot of geneticists. There aren't a lot of genetic counselors around the country, and people are wanting to get a genetic diagnosis for their children, and not being able to get on someone's calendar for 9 months is too long. This is really an important collaboration that GeneDX has with Genome Medical so that families can have the power really in their own hands to click that button, get in touch with someone, get on the phone, get on a virtual call, and ask questions. And then, like I said, get the appropriate test for them.
I don't think that we are making as big of a deal about this telehealth genetic counseling and genetic testing service as we possibly can. I still know families who are on wait lists for more than 9 months, Gay, even in places where there are geneticists. There are people here in Seattle I know who are on waiting lists for it, and I just cannot shout loud enough that this is now something that families can access. I made a joke about this at a talk I just did, that getting a genetic test is now as easy as hanging out with Netflix. So families don't have to go through all of this anguish and waiting and feeling like they're not going to get approved. And some of them drop off, Gay. Some of them give up because they don't know about this opportunity, and they're also just tired.
I know. You know, you and I talk about that all the time. And I always say, when I'm talking even to, our own team at GeneDX, I'm explaining to them that families who are in this situation, they're just having babies, right? They're young children, which means that they themselves as parents are young. They're new to this. So they might not have interacted with the medical system. They might not have interacted with their insurance company. They might not have interacted with schools, social services. Like, there's so much in each one of those things. Though each one of those buckets is a huge project. And so if somebody gives you a diagnosis of cerebral palsy and you know that something is challenged, for your child, it's almost like you're like, okay, I have a diagnosis. I'm finished here. I can move on to school. I can move on to something else. But you really can't. You have to stop and go back, because it's 1 out of 3 children who have a diagnosis of cerebral palsy actually have a genetic component. There are 300 genes that have been identified to be attached or affiliated with a cerebral palsy diagnosis.
So, yeah, that's been the narrative for several years. And I'm going to find the paper and attach it in the show notes as well, because they're actually suspecting now that it is more than 30%. It's up to 50% of people who have a diagnosis of cerebral palsy that actually have a genetic etiology. So it's more than they had even predicted before. And that's because of all this testing that's finally happening, and they're seeing it pop and pop and pop. So it's just so important in so many ways.
So, Effie, there are 10,000 children annually who are diagnosed with cerebral palsy. And all of these families deserve to get greater insights into the symptoms of what their child's facing. They need to find the communities. They need to be connected to treatments. They need to get to those families who can help them and the studies that can help them. Right now, if they don't have the genetic diagnosis, it's almost like they haven't gotten past the symptoms.
100%. And not only that, think about how I know as patient advocacy orgs, how we're trying to reframe that it's not rare, right? It's just rarely diagnosed. So beyond that, what impact would that have on biopharma companies and the development of new treatments when we do start to actually get the majority of these patients diagnosed?
Okay, so Effie, imagine a world where every child who has a rare disease actually gets a genetic diagnosis. Then biopharmaceutical companies who are developing these potential treatments would then understand that these diseases aren't rare. They're just rarely diagnosed. So they would have a bigger patient population to treat, and therefore they'd be able to get more funding to develop the right therapies and solutions for families.
Yes. Gay, do you think that some or a majority, most maybe, families are a little intimidated to actually get a genetic test? Do you feel like that's one of the problems too, is that families just don't want to know, or they don't know that they want to know? Or do you feel like maybe it's clinical and it's in the doctor's office more so that they're not offering it or thinking that it's important? Do you think it's a little bit of both? What do you think it is?
I think it's a little bit of both. And I also think, going back to, parents are young and they're new at this and they're new at the system and they don't want to make their clinician, upset. And if you go, I remember doing this myself, you go to the doctor, your child's having challenges, and the doctor says, everything looks okay, let's just wait another 6 months. Like, there's actually some relief to that, right? Because you're thinking, well, I went to the doctor and the doctor said this. But parents know. I mean, I knew something was not right with my daughter. I knew that she needed help, but I didn't want to make waves. And I kept going through the system. And even though I was changing doctors and I was still trying to get answers, I wasn't actually getting all the tests that were even available way back when. Because remember, she's 28. So I think today it's a combination of both. I think it's families are reluctant to push. And I also think that it's really hard to change ways. If you're a clinician and you're doing your practice a certain way, and we all know they have to see a certain number of patients a day, and it's, they're on a gerbil wheel. So to change their habits is difficult. But what I'm hoping, and I know you're hoping, is that these habits can change so that we can actually abbreviate everything. And if families can get the genetic diagnosis earlier, it will actually free up the calendars of specialists, right? If we can get either newborn screening or pediatricians ordering genetic tests, it leaves the geneticists that are so few and far between to actually do the work of helping us get to the treatments.
There's the easy one, right? It saves money for the payers and the hospitals.
It does.
Yeah.
Because what happens is, and I don't know if you did this, but this is what we did. We started at one hospital with one clinician. We went through a lot of the testing, and then we left and we went to another hospital and we did the exact same testing because they wanted they wanted it in their system. And then we did this multiple times. So the insurance companies could have saved a lot of money and can do that today by just doing an exome or a genome first.
Yeah. I know you all are working on educating clinicians. I'm going to work on continuing to educate parents that they can ask for this and demand it too. So by our powers combined, we're going to get these people diagnosed.
Great.
And just real quick, if you don't mind, Gay, could you give us the explanation of what happened after Lily got a genetic diagnosis when she was a teenager?
Well, gosh, a lot happened. She was able to be taken off all the unnecessary medications that she was on. We were able to identify a compound that helped her for a while. It wasn't the magic bullet, but we were able to build a community. She was the first one diagnosed with her full body presentation. We built a community. There are hundreds now in it. And one of our families actually had identified a compound. We got a mouse model. We put it in, we started the research with great researchers, and families were involved in all of this. And we proved that a small molecule turns back the overexpressed gene. And Lily is night and day today. She went from being a child that had to be lifted into a reclined wheelchair to now she's an adult who gets in and out of her wheelchair and can get herself dressed and, doesn't have a custom molded wheelchair anymore. It's 90 degrees. And I truly believe, Effie, she would not be in that chair if she had had this small compound in the beginning.
Yeah, totally. All from the genetic diagnosis going past CP for her. And let's not forget, she has a bachelor's degree and a handsome fiance. So thanks for sharing about Lily. Okay, well, let's talk about another exciting thing that you all are doing. And this is definitely especially for the patient advocacy orgs. I know some of them heard about it in person last year at our combined brain meeting that we had in person. But if you could you please introduce what you're calling the snapshot and empowering patient orgs and give us sort of the rundown on that information?
Yes. So in my role at GeneDX, there are two areas I focus in. One is educating about genetic testing. So what we were just talking about, of getting the importance of getting a genetic diagnosis, how to access it, like Genome Medical and that telehealth opportunity. But the other side of my role is helping patient advocacy organizations grow their communities through understanding genomic data. Now, that kind of sounds like a mouthful, but what it means is there are biopharma companies that have access to genomic data, and they access this to help them with their programs to increase awareness about the communities that they're building these potential treatments for. So they need to understand things like, where do they put their clinical trials in the country? How many patients are there? What are their age ranges? What should their criteria look like when they're developing a clinical trial? One of the things that I'm very passionate about is making sure that patient advocacy organizations have access to genomic data, like a biopharma company does, but we have to abbreviate it in some way. And the reason is because it's expensive. Data is very expensive. So what we are doing at GeneDX is we are offering two things to patient advocacy organizations. The first one is something at no cost. It's the patient count. So you can contact us at advocacy@genedx.com, and we will send you the number of patients that GeneDX has diagnosed in the U.S. since 2015. And what this number tells you is you can compare it to your registry or your spreadsheet. Whatever level your patient advocacy organization is right now. You don't have to be someone who's, developing a gene therapy or, has even animal models. Like, this is a number that's going to help every patient advocacy organization out there, no matter how newly formed you are. So it tells you that number. You can compare it to the number that you have, and you can make certain deductions about that. So, for example, say I have a spreadsheet and I have 30 people on it. And I know that 30 people have contacted me and are part of our patient advocacy organization now, but GeneDX gives me my patient count and they actually have 60. And I think to myself, okay, how does GeneDX have 60 and I only have 30? Maybe I need to do some more social media. Maybe I need to share my story more widely. Maybe I need to have family calls to get people together. What can I do to attract those other families to come on board and be a part of our community? Now, you could also have the reverse, right? The number could be that maybe you have more than GeneDX has. And how is that possible? Well, there are lots of labs. GeneDX is not the only lab, but we do pride ourselves on being a leader in genomics and genetic testing. So that will teach patient advocacy organizations something. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we're offering, which is brand new, it just launched about a week ago, is called the Discover Snapshot. And a lot of patient advocacy organization leaders on LinkedIn have seen that the Discover platform, which is different than the snapshot, and I'll explain that, but the platform was announced to biopharma companies. And they can go on and they can access many genes to look at what they're thinking about perhaps investing in, what they're working on now, and they can get some information about age ranges and where people are getting diagnosed around the country, different genomic data. What we wanted to do was, when I looked at that, I thought, how can we make something available to patient advocacy organizations and provide some piece of data to them? Because a lot of patient advocacy organizations are very deep in developing potential treatments. So what can we do to help those organizations? Because they're not going to be able to afford the same price tag as biopharma. So our team looked at that and talked to a lot of patient advocacy organizations about how can we help you, because we really are here to help, Effie. And so Discover Snapshot is just that, a moment in time. It's a snapshot where you see not only the patient count, but you also get the age range of when the patient was diagnosed. You get the male-female ratio, and you get a heat map that shows where in the country these patients have been diagnosed. Now, this is different from the patient count because the patient count is no cost and the Discover Snapshot is $3,500. So we want to be really clear that GeneDX is not making money on this, but data does cost money. And so there is a cost for us to pull this data and share this data, and give it to the patient advocacy organizations.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Is it one of the largest or the largest genomic data set?
It's one of the largest. GeneDX actually has 750,000 clinical exomes and genomes. And there are other data sets out there. However, the GeneDX database is clinically sequenced. So not only do we have the genetic sequencing, but we also have the patient's clinical information. And that helps us better understand the connection between a patient's genetic information and their symptoms.
When we got our count from you, you had a little over half of all of our patients. So that was really cool to see, because I feel like we had caught a lot more out of the number you gave us. So I think we're doing pretty good, but we still obviously have a lot of work to do. So can you tell me why a patient advocacy org should consider spending the $3,500, the $3,500 precious dollars, to get the heat map, and maybe talk about how this data strengthens their advocacy, how it can help them engage with biopharma or plan for research initiatives? Tell them why this is so important.
Well, there are two main areas that they can use this. They can use it directly for their patient advocacy organization and the planning that they're doing. And then they can also use it when they're having conversations with biopharma. So I'll give you some examples. If you are a patient advocacy organization and you look at this heat map and you are now spending X amount of dollars to boost your social media posts all over the country, and you can look at this and say, we know a majority of the patients are being diagnosed in this certain state or this region of the U.S., and perhaps we should allocate more money there or more money in areas where we're not attracting patients. You can do it for family meetings if you're planning on getting a group of your families together. If you have planned to have your meeting in Boston because you think that's where everybody's meeting, but you get your heat map and you find that a majority of the patients have been diagnosed in Texas, you might want to think about changing your plans. Now, this is the number of and location of where the patients are diagnosed, not necessarily where they live. So it's important to differentiate that, but it does let you know that patients and families are comfortable traveling to that location and perhaps are getting care in that location. So that's just one example. If you're a patient advocacy organization that has never had or is having conversations with a biopharma company, you can leverage this information because it's a data visual tool that you can take with them and say, this is from GeneDX. This is data that is from a database that's one of the most comprehensive resources for genomic insights. It's built on decades of experience in genetic sequencing and clinical interpretation. And you can take that and have a conversation with them to say, we are here and want a seat at the table. And this is the information that we can share with you. We know that the patients in our community are between, age X and Y. And if you are having a clinical trial and you are putting in your criteria at a different age group, we may not be able to help you fill that clinical trial. This happened with me, Effie, when I was helping for a research study, and the researcher came to me and said, Gay, how many patients do you have? And I told him, and I had all these patients. I was so proud. And then he said, okay, well, we only will be able to take patients 15 and over. And I was like, wait a minute, you just cut my list in half. And he's like, yeah, and they've got to be able to travel to France. And I was like, not everybody's going to be comfortable doing that. And my list dwindled very quickly because what they wanted as researchers was different than what I actually had on my spreadsheet. So if I had been able to go to him while he was making that protocol to say, this is what our community really looks like, he would have been able to do that before the study was put together. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and I know people in our world are real scrappy, so they're already thinking, okay, maybe we could just start a fundraiser, a $3,500 fundraiser, tell the families why it's important, bing, bang, done. Then you don't have to think about, handing over this money right away. And also, what about approaching the company, asking the company to purchase it for you, right? Is that an option?
That is an option. And Effie, I will tell you, this is how much GeneDX wants to help patient advocacy organizations and families. When we first started talking about this, it was a different price tag. And I talked to many advocates and said, is this doable? Can you do this? And they said no. I was able to go back and work with the team and get the price down and be able to go back to those same advocates and say, does $3,500 work? And they said, we can do that. We could have a car wash. We could have a bake sale. We can fundraise within our own community. And yes, they could go to partners they're working with now. So I feel that, with all the research that we've done in our own advocacy organization, I've never seen something that is available that has as much information and data for $3,500. Like that, I know it's a lot of money when you say $3,500 separately, but if you're talking about what this tool can do for you and how it can give you the actual seat at the table with biopharma, it's not a big price tag.
And again, just another reason why it's so important to have someone like you in a role like this who are actually in our community. Question, do you have a list of resources or some sort of connectivity that you give families who are newly diagnosed so they can find their orgs, or do they get to like opt in to be contacted by an org once they get that snapshot or anything like that? So if a family gets a diagnosis from GeneDX and say it's CTNNB1, do they get a letter from GeneDX that says, hey, guess what? You actually have these 2 amazing orgs that are available for your child's diagnosis. Here you go. And, or do you say, would you like to be contacted if someone does start a foundation that maybe doesn't exist for your disorder? Like if someone, if there's a disease that doesn't have an org at this point, but then they make one, could they maybe contact you once they find out all the numbers from GeneDX?
So privacy is utmost importance at GeneDX. So we are not able to, and we do not share patients' information. So we can't connect patients to patients. What we can do and what we're working on is we do have a resource page that goes with every genetic test. And we are now working with our AI team to make it a resource page that will be specific for each patient that's receiving a genetic diagnosis. And it will have organizations on there that will turn them to specific organizations by gene.
Awesome. Music to my ears. Is there anything that I didn't ask you today that I should have about the CP pillar and the snapshot?
I think, Effie, just letting people know how committed we are is what I would like people to know, that we are truly committed to the cerebral palsy community, that we have this opportunity with families having access to genetic testing through the telehealth collaboration with Genome Medical, and letting them know that we have this data through the Discover Snapshot, that they can learn more about their community. And we would love to hear from patient advocacy organization leaders about that.
Okay. And if you could leave parents and patient advocates with one message about genetic testing, what would it be?
Don't wait. If you have not received a genetic diagnosis, you don't know the root cause of the challenges that your child is facing.
Amen. Well, Gay, thank you so much for taking the time to be my guest again today. I'm really thankful for you and for GeneDX for continuing to be such an amazing partner for the rare disease community. And I'm cheering you on. So thank you.
We're thankful for you, Effie. Thanks for having me.
I hope you've been enjoying this podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this show with your people, and please make sure to rate and review it on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also head over to Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to connect with me and stay updated on the show. If you're interested in sharing your story, or if you have anything you would like to contribute, please submit it to my website at effieparks.com. Thank you so much for listening to the show and for supporting me along the way. I appreciate y'all so much. I don't know what kind of day you're having, but if you need a little pick-me-up, Ford's got you.